Hi, this is Phil Shapiro. Welcome to my talk, Promoting Open Source Solutions at the Public Library at the Central PA Open Source Conference 2020. So I work at a public library in Maryland, and I'm very fortunate that my library is a Linux public library. We are very strongly in favor of open source at this library. We have 27 Linux stations available to the public. I've been working there 15 years. People just come in and get their work done, and they don't even know they're not using Windows. We have LibreOffice and Firefox and Chrome, and my job is pretty much like an open source genius bar. People come to me with any kind of question, and I give them answers to their questions, and I help them use the computers, and people trust me because I'm not selling them anything. So I'm creating this, I wanted to give this presentation today to help pass along tips and ideas for how your public library can become more promoting of open source. So that's the purpose of my talk, to help give you some tips and ideas. There are easier, more accessible tips and more kind of medium and more advanced tips. I'm going to cover all of them. Libraries are places where the possible lives. So you've heard it from other people. Books are like a doorway to a whole new world, and books can give you education, which can improve your life and your livelihood. But open source is so much like that. Open source can give you doorways to opportunities, it might sometimes help you with your livelihood. You probably already know that different public libraries have different levels of commitment to open source. So in my library, we have a strong commitment to open source. It's part of our kind of practice at the library. But your public library can have a greater commitment to open source through your involvement. You yourself can help increase the library's commitment in lots of small and bigger ways. So what are the easiest steps you can take? What's the low-hanging fruit? Well, one thing I think that you ought to think about is teaching LibreOffice Draw program. And you could teach it via Zoom or in person after the pandemic. LibreOffice Draw is a simple vector drawing program. And this is what I like to do. I like to find funny photos of animals on the web, and I make them speak using these speech bubbles, kind of like a cartoon thing. And then you can ask youth, what do you think this animal is saying? So if you ask that to a youth, if you find a funny photo, the youth will tell you a very interesting story about what that animal is saying. And so it becomes a very playful way of bringing technology skills to somebody using a free software tool. And it's also a literary, it's a language arts activity. So here is something that I found just to show you what you can do. And I made a presentation on this very topic at the American Library Association about 10 years ago. How to use LibreOffice Draw with these callouts in language arts. So that was in Philadelphia about 10 years ago. So I found a Creative Commons photo of a camel here, and I added a speech bubble. Isn't that an attractive speech bubble? The really neat thing about LibreOffice Draw is that you have very good control of the speech bubble, like where you put the bottom part of it. And then I changed the background of the speech bubble to kind of a sand color. Since we're camels and this is maybe the Sahara Desert. And then I also put in the Creative Commons license. So there's the Creative Commons license. I put that right here into the presentation. And so this nice photo was shared by Charles Fred. So this is also an ideal opportunity to teach the Creative Commons. When you're teaching LibreOffice drawing with photos and speech bubbles, the Creative Commons is an ally of open source because its mission is to promote creativity and the sharing of the best creative work that we can. Here's another idea of what you can do very simply to get your public library to be more promoting of open source. Find the interesting books on open source related topics. A good starting point is the book of Audacity. It's an excellent guidebook, very well written. I did a book review for Make Magazine, and this is a 2013 book review. You could recommend that your public library buy this book. It's still being published, and send them a copy of this review. Copy and paste the URL and say, I think our library ought to buy this book. Audacity is such an interesting program. I use it quite often for different multimedia projects I'm working on and digital storytelling projects I'm working on. Another thing that you can do at your public library is ask the library managers if LibreOffice is installed on the public access computers. So you might have Windows computers with Microsoft Office, but there's no reason why you can't have Microsoft Office and LibreOffice installed on the same computer. Ask them if TuxPaint is installed. TuxPaint has been downloaded millions of times. It's a drawing program for young kids. They say it's suitable for like 4 to 10-year-olds or 4 to 12. I've seen 3-year-old kids just adore TuxPaint. At my public library, the 3-year-old kids, they gurgle with delight when they're sitting at a computer with TuxPaint. TuxPaint is so well designed and so playful and enjoyable. And of course, adults can also use software that's for kids to, there are some adults who might have some phobias about using computers, or computers are not their thing. But if you get them drawing with a fun program, maybe get them drawing with a kid. Have the kid sit on the adult's lap. Ask your library if they have Inkscape installed. So Inkscape is an equivalent of Adobe Illustrator. It's outstanding software, keeps getting better. So it's not only free, but every year it keeps getting better. And I've heard that some features of Inkscape go beyond Adobe Illustrator. GIMP is the equivalent of Photoshop. It also keeps getting better. It's a very powerful tool. You can learn all about GIMP. Go to YouTube. There's thousands of tutorials about GIMP. You can learn how to use GIMP for free. Another thing you can do at your public library is to ask the library staff if they're interested in hosting an Install Fest. And you can find volunteers in your local Linux user group. I hope you belong to a Linux user group. And or just find a couple of friends of yours who love open source. And you can install, this is post-pandemic, typically, or maybe even during the pandemic, but outdoors, in a safe, you can have Windows, update Windows XP or upgrade to Linux, and all of a sudden the computer has new life. Windows Vista computers, if you have a Vista laptop, it runs twice as fast, sometimes 3 times as fast with Linux installed as it does with Vista. I put Linux on old MacBooks. I sometimes install Cloud Ready that turns a MacBook into a Chromebook. And sometimes I like to put on Linux Mint. I adore Linux Mint. So those old MacBooks from like 2006, 2007, you can't put on like a new, a current web browser. So the best way of refurbishing them is to put Linux on them. It might give them 2 or 3 more years of life. Okay, your public library needs to have some involvement with the Raspberry Pi. It's such a fascinating computer. Millions have been sold. And so some public libraries, I believe, are loaning out Raspberry Pis. They loan them out with a little kit or something. But you can also have classes or trainings at the library. You could do your trainings via Zoom. You could have some Zoom kind of thing where you can explain about computer programming on the Pi or any kind of hardware project with the Pi. My very favorite Raspberry Pi project that I happen to hear about is called the Trivia Vending Machine from the Dallas Makerspace. And you can find it on YouTube. Look up Trivia Vending Machine. So here we have a couple of people who have they took a vending machine that they bought on Craigslist. They took out the money part and they put in a Raspberry Pi. And the only way to get the food out of the machine is to write science questions, is to answer science questions. So what a very interesting invention. And they give away, the people who made this, they made it just for fun. There is no patent. They're not intending to market it or sell it. They just wanted to invent it. But it's a very interesting prototype. I'd love to see a portable version of this put together by different communities where you could take it around from place to place, and people could not only earn food by answering questions, but what we want is we want our students to be writing the questions for the trivia vending machine. And it doesn't have to be science questions. It could be literature questions or any kind of interesting thing, maybe a timed math thing or a puzzle, or there's just 1,000 possibilities. You can buy these little vending machine, the motors that turn the thing. You can buy those like secondhand. So you could hack together a portable version of this invention, and it wouldn't take too much effort. And if you track down the people who made it, they might have the source code might be on GitHub. It might be freely available source code for this little homebrew robotics, or not robotics, but Raspberry Pi project, trivia vending machine. So I'm going to ask you, you're watching my presentation, tell people about this. Tell your local library staffer. Now, I do recommend that people establish a relationship with people who work at your library. So some of the people who work at your library are interested in open source and some are less interested. You got to find the ones who are interested and talk to them. It really does no good to be talking to people who aren't interested in something. If they're not interested, that's just a fact. And then you talk to the people who are interested and you cultivate that relationship. And then sometimes very interesting things can happen when you cultivate relationships. Oh, and I ought to mention that perhaps the most powerful thing I can tell you today is ask questions. So send an email to your local library or your local library system and ask them if they have Raspberry Pis on loan. Ask them if they have a Raspberry Pi 400 on loan so that people can take it home and try it out. Some libraries are going to be responsive to that kind of inquiry, and some libraries are less responsive, but the library is going to be non-responsive if nobody asks about it. So I do want you as an open source believer to be asking questions, send email, or if you're visiting the library in person, talk to people and say, I'd like to try out a Raspberry Pi 400. It's a keyboard with a computer. It sounds very interesting. You say, I want to try it out before I buy it. Does the library own one? Is there one here at the library that I can try? Can I take it home? So ask those questions. Let me talk quickly about Inkscape because I adore Inkscape. I made this video, this promotional video, why I love Inkscape drawing program. I made this way back in 2007. Inkscape was pretty young back then. But this is another strategy that you can connect to your public library, is to maybe set up public access stations that are just for graphic design using GIMP and Inkscape and Blender and Krita, K-R-I-T-A. So you could have maybe just a graphic design workstation at your library that's all open source software. And so somebody who's never heard or seen of these programs can sit down and what you as an open source believer can do is assemble a playlist of YouTube videos that are tutorials about Inkscape, tutorials about Blender. Or maybe put together a DVD that people can take out and take home, and it's got a bunch of YouTube videos that have been saved or whatever. There's lots of different ways that you can do things to organize so that other people can have a gentle ramp, an entryway to this. Open Clip Art website is a website that collects public domain clip art. And libraries ought to be promoting this. This is public domain clip art. So Your library staff may or may not know about the Open Clip Art website, but I adore this website. I visit often for different of my graphic design needs, my graphic needs, you know. Openclipart.org. Here's my very favorite piece of art there. This is called African Women with Vessels. And it looks three-dimensional, but it's a two-dimensional drawing. I think it's from somebody in England who has incredible artistic talent. And this was made with Inkscape. This was made with the free vector graphics drawing program. It's an SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics Drawing. And it just shows you the possibilities. Another thing on OpenClipArt is a very practical website. So it helps you answer practical questions such as, what if you were stranded on a desert island? If you were stranded on a desert island, you know, that's an important question that all of us ought to think about. And this is what a desert island looks like. DESSERT. What happens if you were on a desert island? You might not have heard about this new Android phone that costs $35. And it's called the Wiko Ride 2. I believe it's designed in France. Thank you, France. It's available from Boost Mobile here in the United States. But this is a really nice smartphone for $35. I bought one just to try it out. It's 2 gigs of RAM. I'm going to be installing Ubuntu Linux on this thing. Look, it's got 32 gigs of storage. But your public library could have 1 or 2 or 3 of these on hand that people can try them out just to see how responsive they are. Because this is a $35 phone, but 5 years ago, a $35 phone would be barely usable. But today, it's actually a pretty nice phone. And it costs less than a case. If you buy a case for an iPhone, the case costs more than $35. So here you get the whole phone. But this is the role of the public library, is to show that this is possible, because the library needs to bring this possibility to people's view. People who are unemployed or in other ways vulnerable, they need information that can empower their lives. And that's the purpose of the public library, is to empower people in their lives. So you could send a question to your public library and say, does our library have one of these new Android phones for $35 that I could try out either at the library, or if the library is very forward-thinking, you could take it home. Try it out, take it home, and here's another so now we've kind of bypassed the easier things to do that you can do for your library or with your library to promote open source. There's other things you can do. You can make screencasts. So I made this screencast about Gallium OS. Gallium OS is a software that takes a Chromebook and makes it into a full Linux laptop. It doesn't run on all Chromebooks, but it runs on many, especially Chromebooks from about 2013 onwards. The earlier Chromebooks, Gallium OS won't install, I don't think. But you can convert a Chromebook to a whole Linux laptop using this software called Gallium OS. And people might not know that this is possible. So you can contact your local library staff and say, I want to help people in my community understand what's possible with Chromebooks that have expired. So when Chromebooks are no longer getting updates from Google, then the browser becomes more and more outdated and it becomes less safe to use it. And so if we can install a full Linux on a Chromebook, then the Chromebook is detached from Google, and we can install the latest version of Chromium browser. We can put on the latest Firefox, and we can extend the use of these Chromebooks, which would otherwise be discarded. You know, a Chromebook that's no longer getting updates at a certain point is discarded, but knowledge is power. And at the public library, we give away knowledge, and that's why I make screencasts like this screencast. You can see I had 30,000 views. Now that's not a lot, but it's also not a little. And I believe that I've done my part to both support and promote this very interesting software solution. But other libraries other libraries could take what I've done and just have a link on their library website, and they say, do you have an older Chromebook? Have you considered upgrading it to Gallium OS? So that's a very simple thing that a library could have on their blog, linking to this video. And the only reason they have it on the blog is that one of their community members, which is you, tell them, we should maybe have a link to this on the blog. And they'll either think it's a good idea or they won't think it's a good idea. But I can tell you it's a good idea for you to suggest it to them. So I have another video I made called my $20 eBay laptop. I bought a laptop from somebody in New Jersey for $20. It's a 2002 Dell laptop. And believe it or not, it actually works pretty well with Linux Mint installed. I made this video about 6 years ago. But this 2002 laptop is up and working 15 or more years later. If you asked 99% of technology professionals if a 2002 laptop is obsolete or not, they would say it's obsolete. But the person who's saying it's obsolete, they've never lived without a laptop in their life. And so their perspective is a privileged perspective. They don't know what it's like maybe to come to another country. Maybe there's a refugee from a war-torn country who comes to the United States, and they show up here and they need a laptop to get their graduate degree. Well, a $20 laptop from 2002, it might suit their purposes for them to write their master's thesis and do some research online. Now, a 2002 laptop is not fast, but it is functional. And so we need to be able to move beyond our privilege and try not to use words like obsolete technology. It's a pejorative, and it diminishes people who are more vulnerable. So I work at the library where I try to be aware of the subtle uses of words in the way that it might diminish or empower people. So I'm going to suggest that people try not to use the word obsolete quite so much. People get enough of it when they walk into a store. They get enough of the word obsolete from the salespeople, so they don't need to hear that also at the library. Here's a philosophical question I want you to think about and consider. Who owns the public library? Are librarians the landlord of the library building, or are they servants to the community? So sometimes when you walk into a library and you're talking with library managers, the relationship between the community member and the library managers, it could be like the people who are in charge of the library, they make all the decisions, and they don't see themselves as a servant of the community. They see themselves more as the landlord of the building. So you have to kind of figure out how your library managers, how do they feel about themselves in their role at the library? And what we want to do, step by step, what we want to do is move from the former to the latter over here. Now, this particular TED Talk is how I came to the question that I just asked in the previous slide here in the presentation. So there's a library near Denver called the Anythink Library, A-N-Y-T-H-I-N-K, the Anythink Library near Denver. And that's an intentional spelling of the word, Anythink. And I'd like you to look up this video. It's very, very interesting about how libraries see themselves as servants of the community. And here's the director of the library giving a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I'd like you to watch this talk, and then even though Pam Sandley Smith, even though she doesn't mention open source, I want you to think about what her attitude towards open source might be given this particular talk. And so The main point she's making in her talk is that librarians ought to default to yes. So if somebody brings an idea to the library, a library is a house of ideas, and the librarians ought to be interested and encouraging of ideas that walk in the library. And librarians should be thinking, don't think about the reasons something can't be done, think about the reasons it can be done. So this is a shift in philosophical perspective, and you, as somebody who's watching this presentation of mine, you have a role to help your community see this shift in perspective of the role of the public library in their community. It's much more than books. It's much, much more than books. Historically, libraries, that was their purpose, was the distribution of books. I like to think of libraries as zones of uplift. It's a zone of uplift, and I use the phrase digital empowerment, and there's lots of different ways that uplift can happen at a library. Books are one tool for uplift, and then there's many, many other tools that we ought to talk about and put into practice at the public library. I want to talk a little bit about Moodle, the learning management system. What's its role at the public library? So we're living in a knowledge economy. Moodle is open source free software that's totally high quality. It was designed by a very, very smart and generous person in Australia, Martin Dugiamas. It's 20 years old, Moodle. It's used in every single country in the world. And you may or may not be a fan of Moodle yet, but I encourage you to look into it, because Moodle in your public library means that you could be community members in your community can be teaching each other stuff. And this is the Moodle website. I wanted to give a quick screen grab so you get to see it. I'd like you to visit stats.moodle.org. These are the statistics of how much Moodle is used around the world. There's 33 million courses have been made in Moodle. And a quarter of a billion people have registered on Moodle. That's a big number. I love the Moodle quizzes. Look at that. They have, 3 billion quiz questions in Moodle. You can have timed quizzes in Moodle. If you haven't thought about how Moodle fits into your community, I encourage you to think and talk with other people in your community. How can Moodle be used to for civic purposes? To teach. Moodle is used in colleges and universities, it's used in businesses and government. But it's a very flexible tool for teaching. It was designed that way. And so I'd like you to think about it. I just recently set up a Moodle myself. I use a web hosting service called Linode. I pay $5 a month, and my friend Kevin Cole helped me set it up. So I have a friend who is I'm pretty knowledgeable about Linux in general, but I choose friends who are more knowledgeable than me. So Kevin is retired as a system administrator with very strong background in Linux. So I asked Kevin to help me set up a Moodle, and it took him a little time. Moodle is free, but the web hosting, you have to set it up yourself, or you have to pay somebody to set it up. So I want to show you that. Here's what Kevin made for me. Welcome to Phil Shapiro's No Room Schoolhouse. So he came up with that name, and I love the name. He's well attuned to my wacky sense of humor. So I should also mention a couple more things about Moodle. Moodle can be used without the internet. So you can set up like a classroom someplace in a school that's outside of the zone of the internet. They might not even have internet in this geographical location, and students could be using Moodle within a local network at a school. So that's a pretty big deal. People don't know about that. Not enough people know about that. And I have a quick story I got to share about Moodle from an educator colleague of mine, Sheila Gatling, from Brooklyn, New York. I think she's up in Brooklyn. And she told me that middle school teacher, I think retired middle school teacher, she told me one of her 5th or 6th grade students moved from New York to Georgia, and in the middle of the school year moved and continued handing in assignments on the Moodle that her brother had set up in her classroom. The student in Georgia wanted to continue participating. That the student loved Moodle so much and loved this particular teacher that even though they were physically at a different school, they continued handing in assignments. So that's a testament to 2 or 3 different things. First is a testament to how well Moodle is designed. It's also a testament to Sheila Gatling, who's an incredible teacher, and maybe also a testament to this particular student who was so much enjoying the process of expanding their mind via this tool called Moodle. So your homework assignment is to think about what steps you can take this week to make your own public library more open. So you should, if you don't have relationships with some of your library staff, you need to start building those relationships, as I mentioned previously. And also build the relationships by offering to do something for the library. Offer to teach a workshop online. Choose whatever is your passion that's connected to open source, or any of the topics related to open source. So Creative Commons is not open source, but it's related to it. So people need to teach and learn Creative Commons. Privacy, somebody needs to be teaching privacy. So privacy is connected to open source, as you might know. There's some fantastic open source tools that promote privacy. So maybe privacy is what you want to teach at your public library via a Zoom workshop, like steps to protect your own privacy or whatever you choose to share. So this is Phil Shapiro. Thank you for coming to my presentation. And I hope I've given you some ideas and tips about how public libraries can be promoting open source and all the goodness that open source brings to our communities. As I mentioned in the beginning, open source does not have a marketing budget. And too many people in our community have never heard of the many wonderful aspects and tools in open source. So the only way they are going to hear it is if somebody tells them. And it's either going to be you in person or your local institution, the public library, the place where knowledge is distributed. So I'd like you to think about how you can be a catalyst for helping the goodness of open source reach a broader audience in your own community. And it makes the community stronger and maybe more thriving. If you saw this presentation, I'm easily reachable via my email at the very beginning. I'm on Twitter. I make YouTube videos on open source topics as well as other kind of YouTube videos. My YouTube channel is not just open source. There's other dimensions to my life. But you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, or follow me on Twitter, or send me an email. I'm pretty good about answering email, and I'm not overly extended in terms of not having enough time in my day to answer email. So you're always welcome to send me a question or a comment, or tell me about something that you did so that on my next presentation, maybe next year, about promoting open source in libraries, I might have some anecdotes to share there about people who saw this presentation and then decided to take on a role for themselves and for their family and friends to make the world a little bit better place using open source. Thanks. See you next time.